what it is.
Yes, it's what they want. It's where it's gotten. You're close to him. Maybe he'll listen to you.
You know, I talk to him. He's a tough guy to talk to. You know him.
He has no choice. He has no choice. These are the higher-ups.
Well, he's a higher up, too. I mean, no.
Not like this. You know that. Oh, come on, Frank. If they can whack a president, they can whack a president of a union. You know it, and I know it.
When people think about empires, they picture the British Empire, the Roman Empire, or the Spanish Empire. They imagine armies, colonies, and flags planted in foreign soil. America insisted it had no empire. In reality, it built one. It simply operated under a different name. One of the greatest instruments of American power was not a government department. It was a corporation, the United Fruit Company. By the middle of the 20th century, United Fruit had become one of the largest and most powerful corporations in the world. It controlled vast plantations across Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, Jamaica, and El Salvador. Contemporary accounts credited it with nearly 1 million acres of land, more than 2,250 miles of railway, one of the largest privately owned merchant fleets in America, hospitals, hotels, power stations, radio networks, company towns, and tens of thousands of employees. It wasn't simply exporting bananas, it was exporting American influence. The company moved more than 1 million tons of cargo every year. Its Great White Fleet connected Central America with New Orleans and the United States, making well over 1,000 voyages annually. Wherever its ships docked, United Fruit followed with railroads, warehouses, company stores, communication systems, and political influence. Governments rose and fell around it. More than one Central American president discovered that challenging United Fruit often meant challenging the United States itself. The empire had begun almost by accident. Sam Zemurray. Born in Bessarabia, Zemurray arrived in America with almost nothing. He began selling overripe bananas from a pushcart before building his own fruit empire through instinct, determination, and an extraordinary understanding of Central America. He financed Manuel Bonilla's return to power in Honduras, secured lucrative concessions, and transformed the Cuyamel Fruit Company into United Fruit's greatest rival. By 1930, United Fruit had little choice but to buy him. The acquisition made Zemurray one of the company's largest shareholders. When the Great Depression devastated United Fruit's stock price, Zemurray walked into the boardroom carrying enough proxies to seize control. He dismissed executives, reorganized the company from top to bottom, and restored it to profitability. He became the undisputed ruler of Banana Land. But Zemurray understood something that executives sitting comfortably in Boston never truly appreciated. Bananas spoiled. Every hour they remained on a dock cost money. Every delay threatened profits. To build an empire stretching across Central America required more than plantations, railways, and steamships. It required ports. And no port mattered more than New Orleans. Every shipment entering the United States from Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, and much of the Caribbean eventually passed through New Orleans before traveling inland by rail. Whoever influenced that waterfront influenced one of the largest commercial operations in the Western Hemisphere. That was where Charles Millionaire Charlie Matranga entered the story. History usually remembers Matranga as the patriarch of New Orleans organized crime. What is often forgotten is that he spent his professional life inside the fruit business itself. His obituary, published in the New Orleans States on October 29, 1943, recorded that before retiring 25 years earlier, Charles Matranga had worked for both the Standard Fruit and Steamship Company and the United Fruit Company for 50 years. Officially, he was described as a retired stevedore. In reality, he had spent half a century working on the very docks that connected America's fruit empire to Central America. That detail changes the way New Orleans should be understood. Matranga was not simply operating around the waterfront, he operated within it. He worked alongside shipping agents, dock foremen, laborers, produce merchants and railway operators, whose livelihoods depended upon moving thousands of tons of highly perishable fruit from ship to warehouse, from warehouse to railcar, and from railcar to markets across the United States. Millionaire Charlie had become one of the wealthiest figures in New Orleans by the later years of his life. His fortune was reportedly worth more than $10 million, equivalent to roughly $200 million to $245 million today, depending on the precise year during the 1930s. Much of that wealth was legitimate, accumulated through real estate, vast landholdings, commercial contracts, and the companies he controlled throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. His fortune may have exceeded the personal wealth of better-known underworld figures such as Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano, which explains why the name Millionaire Charlie followed him for the rest of his life. For United Fruit, controlling plantations was only the beginning. The fruit still had to reach American consumers. That required reliable docks, reliable labor, reliable transportation. Above all, it required information. Modern produce markets still operate on exactly the same principle. In Mexico City's enormous Central de Abasto, thousands of porters known as diableros spend their days hauling produce across one of the largest food markets in the world. But carrying fruit is only part of their job. They are also the market's intelligence network. They know what has arrived before anyone else. They know how much has landed, how quickly it is selling, and what prices buyers are paying. Within minutes, that information reaches wholesalers and market operators, allowing prices to change long before most customers even know a shipment has arrived. The New Orleans waterfront functioned in much the same way. Long before computers, refrigeration or electronic inventories, information traveled with the men unloading the ships. The dock worker knew which vessel had entered the harbor. The stevedore knew what cargo it carried. The porter moving crates into the wholesale markets knew how much fruit had arrived. The producers knew what would become scarce before retailers ever reached the market. Knowledge moved almost as quickly as the cargo itself. Charles Matranga spent 50 years inside that system. He understood that controlling the movement of produce meant understanding the movement of information. Every shipment arriving from Central America represented more than bananas. It represented prices, supply, demand, profit. Bananas could not wait. Ships could not remain tied to the dock. Rail cars could not sit idle. Every delay cost money. Every strike threatened millions of dollars. For companies like United Fruit, stable relationships throughout the waterfront were not simply desirable. They were essential. The docks generated information. The wholesale markets generated prices. The railroads generated distribution. Together they formed the commercial heart of United Fruit's American empire. It is therefore little surprise that New Orleans became one of the company's most strategically important cities. Whoever understood the waterfront understood the fruit trade. Whoever influenced the movement of produce influenced one of the largest corporations in the Western Hemisphere. By the 1930s and 1940s, the worlds of corporate America, organized labor, shipping interests, produce merchants, politicians, and organized crime all intersected on the New Orleans waterfront. The influence of United Fruit stretched far beyond Louisiana. By the early 1950s, Guatemala had become one of the company's most valuable holdings. It controlled enormous plantations, the country's principal Atlantic port, and much of its railway infrastructure. When President Jacobo Arbenz introduced agrarian reforms that threatened United Fruit's unused land holdings, the company fought back through its extensive political influence in Washington. Those connections reached the highest levels of government. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles had both previously worked at Sullivan and Cromwell, the Wall Street law firm that represented United Fruit, and many of America's largest international corporations. Other senior officials also possessed close relationships with the company, helping transform what began as a commercial dispute into a Cold War confrontation. In 1954, the CIA launched Operation PB Success. Arbenz was overthrown. Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas assumed power. For the CIA, it became one of its earliest and most celebrated covert victories. For United Fruit, one of its greatest commercial threats had disappeared. Guatemala quickly became something else, a training ground. Before the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, CIA-backed Cuban exiles trained there before attempting to overthrow Fidel Castro. The same country whose government had been removed through covert action now served as a staging ground for future American intelligence operations throughout Latin America. The pattern repeated itself. Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, the Caribbean. Ports, railways, plantations, shipping lanes and banks became pieces of a much larger geopolitical chessboard. Officially, the CIA existed to contain Soviet influence. In practice, many of its earliest covert operations also protected American strategic and commercial interests abroad. The line between national security and corporate security became increasingly difficult to separate. Years later, Robert Kennedy would slowly begin to understand that the organizations he was fighting extended far beyond traditional organized crime. The world was not divided into gangsters on one side and governments on the other. It was a web: corporations, banks, shipping companies, labor unions, intelligence agencies, political machines, organized crime. Each occupied its own place within a system that had been developing for generations before the Kennedy administration ever entered the White House. Understanding that system would become essential to understanding the war Robert Kennedy was about to fight. The Mafia did not become powerful all at once. It learned. Every crisis forced it to change. Every investigation taught it what not to do. Every war, prohibition law, and political campaign showed it another weakness inside the American system. Each stage made it richer, harder, and more efficient. Prohibition created the first generation of kings. Before 1920, most criminal organizations had been local. They controlled neighborhood gambling, extortion, prostitution, theft, and protection rackets. Prohibition changed the scale of everything. Once liquor became illegal, the men capable of supplying it were no longer running street gangs. They were running corporations. They needed accountants to manage the money, warehouses to store the alcohol, trucks to move it, garages to repair the trucks, ships to bring liquor across the Atlantic and through the Caribbean, coastal landing points where cargoes could be unloaded without interference, safe houses and distribution centers in cities across America, brewery equipment, bottling plants, restaurants, nightclubs and speakeasies where the product could be sold, police officers who looked away, politicians who kept the police under control, judges who could make cases disappear. They needed overseas suppliers, customs contacts, freight handlers, dock workers, and union officials. They had to import liquor, export money, launder profits, and maintain covert communications across state lines and national borders. Prohibition taught organized crime how to build an invisible economy. By the time the experiment ended in 1933, much of America was financially broken. The Great Depression had destroyed banks, savings, and legitimate fortunes. The gangsters were sitting on cash. Hundreds of millions of dollars had passed through the bootlegging economy. The men who controlled it emerged with fleets of vehicles, political contacts, private armies, warehouses, legitimate businesses, and enough money to influence elections. That made them more than criminals. It made them political targets. Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and their allies believed they had mastered the system. They had paid policemen, judges, and ward leaders. They had learned how votes were delivered and how candidates were selected long before the public entered the polling booth. In 1928, many of those urban machines backed Governor Al Smith for president. Smith was everything the old political organizations understood. He was a New Yorker, a product of Tammany Hall, an opponent of prohibition, and a Catholic with deep support in the immigrant cities where organized crime had built its strength. But Smith lost. His Catholicism, his opposition to prohibition, and his ties to New York machine politics made him unacceptable across much of the country. Then came Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not a ward politician. He was an aristocrat. He understood power differently. While Luciano and Costello were learning to play checkers with district leaders, Roosevelt and the men around him were already playing chess with governors, financiers, judges, and national institutions. Costello and Luciano were willing to support Roosevelt, but they remained tied to Al Smith and the Tammany organization behind him. Roosevelt's people understood that those old loyalties gave New York's political machine too much leverage. Before Roosevelt could dominate the state, the machine had to be weakened. The weapon was Judge Samuel Seabury. Seabury led a sweeping investigation into corruption throughout New York City. He examined judges, magistrates, police officers, public officials, and the political organizations protecting them. Men accustomed to handling their affairs privately were dragged before hearings and ordered to explain their wealth. The proceedings exposed the machinery that prohibition had built. Police officers earning ordinary salaries possessed bank accounts they could not explain. Magistrates had investments far beyond their legitimate income. Public officials who had spent years protecting gambling houses, speakeasies, and rackets suddenly had to account for cash that had never appeared on a tax return. Again and again, investigators heard the same excuse. A relative had died. The money had been left behind. It had been hidden in a tin box because the deceased had not trusted the banks. After the crash of 1929, the explanation sounded plausible to ordinary Americans. Millions had lost faith in financial institutions, but it could not explain the sheer amount of money appearing in the hands of minor officials. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, fortunes worth hundreds of thousands in modern terms. The inquiry became known for its procession of miraculous inheritances and money supposedly discovered in forgotten containers. The tin boxes became symbols of the entire system. Luciano understood that Seabury was tearing through his political protection. Policemen, commissioners, and politicians who had once seemed untouchable were being exposed in public. The organizations that had protected the rackets were being dismantled one witness at a time. Luciano initially treated the problem as if it were personal. He believed Seabury could be pressured, isolated, or neutralized through the usual channels. But Seabury was not acting alone. Behind the investigation stood a political movement determined to destroy Tammany's ability to bargain with Roosevelt as an equal. Luciano thought he was negotiating with another politician. He was being repositioned by an entire class of men who understood how to use the law, the press, and reform movements to break an opponent before offering him a new arrangement. Roosevelt became governor and then president. The old criminal political alliance in New York began to collapse. Dutch Schultz was among the first major figures to recognize the danger. Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey began attacking the city's rackets with a methodical intensity that made bribery and intimidation increasingly difficult. Schultz wanted Dewey murdered. The commission refused. Killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring federal and state power down on every family in the country. Schultz would not abandon the plan, so the underworld abandoned Schultz. He was murdered in 1935. Dewey continued. In 1936, he prosecuted Lucky Luciano on compulsory prostitution charges and obtained a sentence of 30 to 50 years. Louis Lepke Buchalter, under increasing pressure, eventually surrendered and was handed into federal custody before being convicted of murder and sent to the electric chair. The empire created by prohibition scattered. Frank Costello strengthened his influence in Louisiana. Meyer Lansky moved deeper into Florida, Cuba, and the Caribbean. Benjamin Siegel traveled west, first into California and later into Nevada. Luciano went to prison. The pressure had not destroyed the syndicate. It had forced it to expand. New York was no longer enough. The men who survived began moving their money and influence into places where state lines, national borders, and fragmented law enforcement jurisdictions could protect them. Louisiana became one of the most valuable centers. Costello had cultivated political and gambling interests there for years. New Orleans offered shipping, vice, casinos, lotteries, ports, and access to the Caribbean. Those interests helped create the foundations upon which Carlos Marcello would later build his own organization. Marcello understood the territory. Louisiana was not simply another American state. It was the northern edge of the Caribbean. From New Orleans, business traveled into Cuba, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico. Ships carried fruit, sugar, coffee, and minerals north. Money, machinery, guns, and political influence traveled south. The same routes used for legitimate goods could carry contraband. Behind bananas could come narcotics. Behind machinery could come weapons. Behind business delegations could come couriers and intelligence agents. Marcello knew the port operators, the labor men, the political bosses, and the dictators who could be approached. A payment in the right office could clear a shipment, secure a license, or make an investigation disappear. The Mafia's Caribbean expansion also created the conditions Meyer Lansky needed to develop casinos across Cuba and beyond. Gambling houses were not merely places where tourists lost money. They were cash machines capable of laundering criminal proceeds, financing political operations, and transferring wealth across borders without attracting the same scrutiny as conventional banks. The American underworld was becoming international. Then the Second World War changed everything again. Europe was devastated. Britain was financially exhausted. France had been occupied. Germany lay in ruins. The United States emerged with its industries intact, its military expanded, and its corporations positioned to dominate the post-war world. The Mafia understood the opportunity because it had already built the necessary infrastructure: ports, ships, unions, warehouses, foreign contacts, smuggling routes, political protection. The government understood it too. In 1942, American officials feared that German and Italian agents might sabotage the East Coast docks and shipyards. The burning of the French liner Normandy, while it was being converted into a troop transport in New York, intensified those fears. The waterfront had become a matter of national security. Naval intelligence needed access to the docks. It needed information from longshoremen, fishermen, shipping agents, and labor leaders. Those communities were difficult for outsiders to penetrate. Someone suggested approaching the Mafia. The government turned to Meyer Lansky. Lansky acted as the intermediary to Lucky Luciano, who remained in prison but still exercised considerable influence over the New York waterfront. An arrangement developed that became known as Operation Underworld. Luciano's associates would help protect the docks, report suspicious activity, and guarantee labor peace. In return, Luciano expected consideration. Thomas Dewey had built his national reputation by imprisoning Luciano. By then, Dewey was governor of New York and a rising presidential contender. The wartime arrangement placed him in an extraordinary position. The prosecutor who had sent Luciano away now approved his transfer from the brutal prison at Dannemora to the more comfortable Great Meadow facility closer to Albany. After the war, Dewey commuted Luciano's sentence on the condition that he accept deportation. Luciano walked out of prison but was forced to leave the United States. The alliance had worked. The federal government had discovered that organized crime could be useful. The Mafia had discovered that cooperation with American intelligence could produce rewards unavailable through bribery alone. The relationship did not end with the war. Through Sicilian contacts, underworld figures reportedly assisted Allied authorities before and after the invasion of Sicily. Criminal and political networks helped identify local power brokers, gather information, and contain communist influence in parts of post-war Italy. The Office of Strategic Services had built relationships with businessmen, lawyers, politicians, émigrés, smugglers, and criminals wherever those relationships served the war effort. When the conflict ended, President Harry Truman dissolved the OSS. A powerful circle of men believed that was a mistake. Among them were Sam Zimuri, William Donovan, Richard Helms, Paul Helliwell, Alan Dulles, and Thomas Dewey. They came from a different side of New York than Luciano and Lansky. They belonged to Wall Street law firms, established political circles, and the upper levels of American finance. They saw themselves as pragmatic patriots entrusted with shaping the new world. They also understood the lesson the war had taught. The United States could not dominate the post-war order without a permanent intelligence service capable of operating beyond the normal restraints of diplomacy and law. Alan Dulles had served in the OSS. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was one of the country's most influential international lawyers and foreign policy strategists. Both men had worked for Sam Zimuri under United Fruit Company. Dewey possessed his own national network of lawyers, businessmen, politicians, mafia members, and intelligence veterans. Together with others from the wartime establishment, they helped press for the creation of a successor to the OSS. In 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act. The Central Intelligence Agency was born. Officially, the CIA existed to gather intelligence and protect the United States against communism. But many of the men shaping it carried another belief. American corporations operating overseas were part of American national power. Protecting their mines, plantations, oil fields, shipping routes and banks could therefore be treated as a matter of national security. The CIA became the guardian of an empire that still refused to call itself an empire. It was in this world that organized crime became useful again. The Mafia possessed qualities the agency often needed. It could move money without records. It could obtain weapons without formal authorization. It controlled ports and unions. It had contacts inside foreign governments. It could recruit killers, smugglers, and couriers whose actions could be denied by Washington. Its men were expendable. Its operations came with no congressional hearings and no official casualty lists. The old OSS relationship had created a model. The CIA expanded it. In post-war France, communist-led dock strikes threatened American shipping and the Marshall Plan. In Marseille, Corsican gangsters, American intelligence interests, and anti-communist labor groups worked against the strikers. Violence followed. The docks reopened. They also became one of the principal gateways for heroin traveling from the eastern Mediterranean into Europe and then to the United States. The same men who broke communist control of the waterfront gained control of the narcotics routes running through it. The alliance was never clean. It was not designed to be. Meyer Lansky had used his role in freeing Luciano to elevate himself within the American underworld. Sicilian bosses who had once treated him as an outsider now recognized his value. Luciano's deportation also gave Lansky greater control over the syndicate's American investments. With Luciano's support, Lansky pushed the organization further into banking, property, tourism, casinos, and international finance. It became, in his own description, bigger than United States Steel. Luciano expanded the foreign side. Lansky expanded the financial side. The CIA expanded the political side. Their interests did not always align, but they repeatedly traveled along the same roads. Thomas Dewey and Alan Dulles also understood that a permanent intelligence agency required protection inside Washington. Congress had created the CIA. Congress could investigate it, restrict it, or dismantle it. The agency needed friends. Promising politicians received help, information, endorsements, and access to powerful networks. Their campaigns benefited from money and introductions that were rarely explained publicly. One young congressman who attracted attention was Richard Nixon. Dewey admired Nixon's aggressive anti-communism and practical approach to power. Nixon supported the creation of the CIA and became nationally famous through the Alger Hiss case. Secret intelligence and political ambition began to reinforce one another. In 1950, Nixon defeated Helen Gahagan Douglas for a California Senate seat after portraying her as dangerously sympathetic to communism. 2 years later, Dwight Eisenhower selected him as his running mate, with Dewey playing an influential role inside the Republican Party. After Eisenhower's victory, Allen Dulles became director of the CIA. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. Nixon became vice president. The circle had reached the center of power. At the same time, Meyer Lansky's position continued to strengthen. Federal tax investigators examined him, but major prosecutions failed to materialize. Immigration authorities explored deportation, but did not complete the effort. Through the 1950s, Lansky, Dulles, and Nixon prospered in their separate worlds. Then Cuba brought those worlds together. Lansky had first entered Cuban gambling during the 1930s and developed a close relationship with Fulgencio Batista. With Batista's support, Lansky and his partners expanded their casinos and hotels. The island offered everything the syndicate required: proximity to the United States, a corruptible government, weak regulatory controls, international tourists, banks capable of moving money, a police force willing to protect gambling, a dictator who understood the value of partnership. The Second World War disrupted tourism, and Batista left power for a period. American corporations feared that growing political instability and communist influence might threaten their Cuban investments. When Batista returned through a military coup in 1952, Lansky and the gambling syndicate returned with him. Havana became the capital of the underworld's international casino empire. The casinos generated enormous profits. They also allowed money to be skimmed, transferred, and concealed. Gambling revenues could disguise narcotics money, labor racketeering proceeds, and funds from other illicit enterprises. The arrangement also appealed to intelligence services. Money could be moved through casinos without appearing in a government budget. Payments to agents, informants, and covert operators could be disguised among millions of dollars in gambling transactions. Cuba became a meeting ground for American business, the CIA, organized crime, and the Batista dictatorship. Then Fidel Castro came down from the Sierra Maestra. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled. Lansky's casino empire collapsed with him. American corporations faced nationalization. The Mafia lost its most valuable offshore territory. The CIA saw a communist government 90 miles from Florida. All three wanted Castro removed. The agency began organizing an exile invasion. Cuban recruits were gathered, trained, and equipped. Guatemala, already transformed by the CIA's overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in 1954, became one of the staging grounds. The plan eventually became the Bay of Pigs invasion. Alongside it developed another operation. Castro was to be assassinated. The CIA turned once again to the underworld. Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent working under a covert relationship with the agency, contacted Johnny Roselli. Roselli brought in Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante. The government had declared these men enemies at home. Abroad, it offered them money to commit murder. President John F. Kennedy inherited the invasion plan shortly after entering office. CIA officials presented it as an operation already far advanced. Kennedy approved the landing, but refused to provide the open American air support the exiles required. The invasion collapsed on the beach. The CIA blamed Kennedy. Kennedy blamed the CIA. The Mafia lost its chance to recover Cuba. The anti-Castro exiles felt betrayed. From that moment, the alliance that had grown out of the Second World War began turning against the White House. The Cuban Missile Crisis deepened the divide. Many within the CIA believed the discovery of Soviet missiles created the opportunity for a full invasion. Kennedy chose negotiation. The missiles were removed, but in return the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. To the hardliner anti-Castro networks, Kennedy had surrendered. While the administration explored back-channel contacts with Castro, covert operations continued through a machinery Kennedy could not completely control. The agency, organized crime, and exile groups had been given years to construct their own operational world. It included camps, ships, private aircraft, weapons caches, false identities, and assassination teams. The president could issue an order. That did not mean every element obeyed. By 1962, Robert Kennedy was beginning to see the outlines of the system. He had entered government believing organized crime consisted of families, bosses, and street rackets. The deeper he looked, the more he found corporations, unions, political machines, intelligence agencies, foreign dictators, and international financial networks operating beside them. Thomas Dewey appeared repeatedly in that history. Dewey had imprisoned Luciano. Then, during the war, he had approved the arrangements that helped secure his release. He had fought the Mafia as a prosecutor, but later worked within the same political establishment that helped create the CIA, the successor to an intelligence service that had already learned to cooperate with the underworld. To Kennedy, the contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. The government had used the Mafia when it needed the docks. It had used the Mafia in Sicily. It had tolerated criminal allies when they fought communists in Europe. It had used the Mafia to protect foreign investments. Then it had used the Mafia to kill Castro. Now, Robert Kennedy was expected to prosecute the same men as though none of those arrangements had ever existed. The files led everywhere: New Orleans, Miami, Havana, Guatemala, Panama, the Bahamas, Marseille, Mexico. The routes connected gambling to narcotics, narcotics to ports, ports to labor unions, and labor unions to political money. Carlos Marcello stood at the center of the Gulf and Caribbean system. His Louisiana organization sat astride New Orleans, one of America's most important gateways to Latin America. The same docks that moved bananas, sugar, and coffee could move men, weapons, and contraband. Marcello's influence reached through political figures, law enforcement officers, union contacts, and foreign relationships. The fruit companies had already demonstrated how commercial power could spread from New Orleans into Central America. Organized crime traveled through many of the same networks. Meyer Lansky built the casinos. Trafficante developed connections through Florida and Cuba. Roselli served as a bridge between the underworld, Hollywood, Las Vegas, and intelligence operations. Giancana commanded Chicago. Marcello controlled Louisiana. Behind them were bankers, lawyers, pilots, businessmen, police officers, and political intermediaries. It was not a single conspiracy directed from one office. It was a system of overlapping interests. Then came Dallas. President Kennedy was killed while his administration was confronting organized crime, considering accommodation with Castro, and discussing changes inside the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald appeared to be a pro-Castro Marxist. Yet his history ran through a far more complicated landscape. He had served at a marine installation connected to U-2 operations in Japan. He defected to the Soviet Union and later returned to the United States without facing the punishment many expected. In New Orleans, he established a one-man chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and handed out pro-Castro literature bearing an address linked to a building used by anti-Castro activists. He fought publicly with Cuban exiles and sought press attention. Everything about him seemed designed to leave a trail. Around the same time, witnesses connected him to David Ferry. Ferry had participated in anti-Castro activities and possessed relationships within the intelligence and exile worlds. He also worked as an investigator and pilot for Carlos Marcello's legal organization. That placed him at the intersection Robert Kennedy had only recently begun to understand. CIA operations, the Cuban exiles, New Orleans organized crime, private aviation, the anti-Castro underground. After Oswald was arrested, Ferry drove through the night toward Texas and spent hours making calls from a public telephone near Houston. His explanation for the journey never satisfied investigators. 2 days later, Jack Ruby murdered Oswald. Ruby carried his own Chicago history. He had moved through labor circles connected to Paul Dorfman and the Teamsters, knew gamblers and underworld figures, and operated a Dallas nightclub frequented by police officers and visiting racketeers. Before the assassination, he had placed calls to men with organized crime and labor connections. He had visited Louis McWillie, a casino operator associated with Lansky's World in Cuba. When Ruby killed Oswald, the one man capable of explaining his own actions was silenced. The official investigation concluded that Oswald had acted alone, but to Robert Kennedy, the broader machinery must have looked terrifyingly familiar. The CIA had worked with the Mafia. The Mafia had worked with anti-Castro exiles. The exiles had trained in camps connected to intelligence operations. Oswald had appeared in the middle of that environment. Ferry connected back to Marcello. Ruby connected back to Chicago, labor racketeering, and the casino world. Every road seemed to lead into another road. Years later, President Richard Nixon would respond to the Watergate arrests by demanding that the CIA block the FBI investigation. On the White House tapes, he warned that a deeper inquiry could expose the Bay of Pigs thing. Those words suggested that Watergate was not simply a burglary. It was the latest eruption of a hidden alliance that had begun during the Second World War. The docks, Operation Underworld, the OSS, the creation of the CIA Cuba, the casinos, the plots against Castro, Dallas, Watergate. Different events, many of the same men, many of the same methods, and behind them, the same belief that American power could be protected only by operating beyond the reach of the American public. The Mafia had grown stronger by learning from each new age. Prohibition taught it logistics. The Depression taught it finance. Political investigations taught it secrecy. The Second World War taught it intelligence. The CIA taught it international warfare. By the time Robert Kennedy began following the connections, he was no longer investigating a collection of criminal families. He was looking into the hidden architecture of the American empire. On November 22, 1963, the world stopped. Millions first heard the news over the radio, others waited for the newspapers. A week later, on November 29th, Life magazine published the photographs that would define the century. President John F. Kennedy smiling as his motorcade rolled through Dallas, followed by the terrible sequence that ended with rifle fire in Dealey Plaza. The images were black and white, but history had already begun to change color. Standing among the crowd that afternoon was a dress manufacturer named Abraham Zapruder. Armed with a small home movie camera, he captured the assassination frame by frame. In a matter of seconds, he had filmed the most important crime scene in American history. Stunned by what he had witnessed, Zapruder suddenly found himself surrounded by reporters, FBI agents, government officials, and men whose identities were never fully explained. Everyone wanted the film. Everyone understood its value. While the cameras focused on Dealey Plaza, another story was unfolding inside the Texas School Book Depository. The shots had barely stopped before Dallas police officers rushed into the building with revolvers drawn. They climbed the stairwell floor by floor, racing toward the 6th floor, where they believed the assassin had fired from. On one of the lower landings, a Dallas police officer came face to face with a man. Like every experienced Texas officer, he had been trained to watch the hands first. Hands killed policemen. The man immediately raised both hands. The officer leveled his revolver directly at him. The man was Lee Harvey Oswald. For a brief moment, the future balanced on a trigger. Then the building superintendent, Roy Truly, stepped between them. He identified Oswald as an employee of the depository. He belonged there. The officers were still searching for the sniper above them and had no reason to detain every worker in the building. Reluctantly, the officer lowered his weapon and continued upstairs. By the time officers reached the 6th floor, Oswald was already moving calmly toward the exit. Whether his departure reflected guilt or simple fear has been debated ever since. But one fact has remained difficult to ignore. If the President of the United States had just been murdered outside your workplace, the natural reaction for most innocent people would have been to stay, answer questions, and watch events unfold. Oswald did the opposite. He left. Inside the depository, investigators soon recovered the rifle, spent cartridge cases and other evidence. The suspected gunman was gone. The building itself presented another puzzle. According to early reports, several employees could not immediately be accounted for. Some accounts placed that number as high as 9. Yet almost immediately, attention settled on Lee Harvey Oswald. To this day, researchers have struggled to identify precisely which officer first formally named Oswald as Kennedy's suspected assassin. The officer who encountered Oswald on the staircase has remained one of the most intriguing figures in the case. One interpretation argues that his mission had never been to identify Oswald at all. According to that theory, he had been expected to kill him inside the building, claim the suspect had resisted arrest, recover or plant a weapon, and close the case before it ever truly began. A dead assassin would answer no questions. Instead, Oswald walked away. The officer who had pointed a gun at him was left with no choice but to become part of the official investigation, while his own role quietly disappeared into history. Oswald made his way back to his rooming house. Rather than remaining near Dealey Plaza, he returned home, changed his clothes, and armed himself with a revolver. His landlady later recalled something unusual. Around 12:45 to 1 p.m., a police car pulled up outside the house. The horn sounded once, then again. The officers waited for several minutes but received no response before speeding away. Why they left has remained another unanswered question. By then, descriptions of the suspected assassin were already being broadcast across Dallas police channels. Detectives were identifying Oswald, locating his address, and dispatching patrol cars toward him. Time was becoming critical. When Oswald finally emerged, the officers were already gone. His landlady watched him standing near a bus stop. Yet the route serving that stop led directly back toward Dealey Plaza, the very place he supposedly had every reason to avoid. He was clearly not waiting for that bus. Instead, he continued on foot. A short time later, Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit crossed his path. What happened on 10th Street would become almost as controversial as the assassination itself. Witnesses overwhelmingly identified Oswald as Tippit's killer. What they could not agree upon was exactly what he was wearing. Some described a jacket he was not wearing. Others recalled different colors or different clothing altogether. For decades, critics pointed to those inconsistencies as proof that the witnesses could not be trusted. The FBI eventually reached a different conclusion. Modern psychology has repeatedly demonstrated that traumatic events disrupt memory. Witnesses often remember the violence itself with remarkable clarity, while confusing peripheral details such as clothing, height, or facial features. Investigators still encounter the same phenomenon today, even when surveillance cameras exist alongside eyewitness testimony. Most of the Tippit witnesses heard gunfire first, and only then turned to look. Their memories were formed after the trauma had already begun. One witness stood apart. He was driving directly toward the scene before the shooting occurred. He watched Oswald walking calmly along the street. He saw Officer Tippit pull alongside him. He watched the patrol stop. He observed the conversation through the driver's window before either man left his position. From his vantage point, nothing had yet become traumatic. He saw Tippit step from his patrol car. His service revolver remained holstered. Tippit did not believe the man standing before him posed an immediate threat. The moment he stepped clear of the vehicle, Oswald opened fire. As the driver continued past the scene, he watched everything unfold in his rearview mirror. His description of both the encounter and the shooting would later align closely with FBI findings and subsequent investigations. Oswald was now running. Within hours, he was arrested inside the Texas Theater, not for killing President Kennedy, but on suspicion of murdering Officer J.D. Tippit. By the time Dallas police returned to headquarters and dispatched officers to Lee Harvey Oswald's rooming house, he was already in handcuffs. Investigators were preparing the paperwork to charge him with the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit. Whatever plan had been set in motion had clearly gone badly wrong. If the men behind Oswald had expected him to die inside the Texas School Book Depository, every event that followed became an emergency. A dead assassin leaves behind a simple story. A living suspect creates problems. Every agency that had ever crossed paths with Lee Harvey Oswald suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny. The FBI, the CIA military intelligence, counterintelligence units. Every file was reopened. Every contact became important. Instead of a corpse, America now had a man standing before television cameras insisting he had done nothing. "I didn't shoot anybody. They're taking me in because of the fact I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy." Those words echoed around the world. The accused assassin of the President of the United States was not confessing. He was denying everything. While Oswald maintained his innocence, another narrative was rapidly taking shape. Intelligence officials, journalists, informants, anti-Castro activists, and government agencies all began constructing competing explanations almost immediately. But Oswald remained alive. For 2 days. Then came Jack Ruby. Ruby had been unusually close to the investigation from the beginning. He appeared at police headquarters during Oswald's press conference. When one foreign journalist awkwardly asked about the Fair Play for Cuba committee, mispronouncing its name, a voice behind him corrected him instantly. The man who supplied the correction was Jack Ruby. Ruby was not simply watching events, he was already inside them. According to several accounts, he had previously attempted to reach Oswald while he was being questioned, but was prevented by a police officer before getting close enough. On November 24th, as detectives prepared to transfer Oswald to the county jail, Ruby stepped from the crowd. Revolver in hand, one shot. Lee Harvey Oswald collapsed before millions of television viewers. The only man formally accused of assassinating President Kennedy was dead. The investigation exploded. Telephones rang across Washington, New Orleans, Dallas, Miami, and Langley. Reporters contacted informants. Intelligence agencies compared files. Federal investigators expanded surveillance. The FBI intensified electronic monitoring. The CIA quietly reviewed sensitive operations. Robert Kennedy was already speaking with intelligence officials while privately confronting another possibility. In Louisiana, Oswald's connections formed an uncomfortable web. David Ferry, Guy Bannister, Camp Street, anti-Castro Cuban exiles. His uncle, Charles Murrett, associated with Sam Sayer's criminal organization. Then there was Dean Andrews. Years before the assassination, Oswald's mother had sought Andrews' help in bringing her son home from the Soviet Union. After Oswald returned to the United States, he again turned to Andrews, seeking assistance in obtaining travel documents and visas for his Russian-born wife and daughter. Dean Andrews also happened to be one of Carlos Marcello's lawyers. To Robert Kennedy and others already engaged in a relentless campaign against Marcello's organization, those relationships demanded attention. Whether they ultimately proved meaningful or coincidental remains one of the enduring questions surrounding the assassination. What cannot be disputed is what followed. The assassination of John F. Kennedy did not simply kill a president. It triggered a struggle inside the American establishment itself. The CIA moved to protect its operations. The FBI expanded its investigations. Journalists chased sources that had previously remained silent. Organized crime figures found themselves under renewed surveillance. Intelligence agencies watched one another as closely as they watched their targets. The battle was no longer only about who killed John F. Kennedy. It had become a battle over who would control the story that survived him. For a brief moment, Robert F. Kennedy looked untouchable. As Attorney General, he had launched the most aggressive assault on organized crime in American history. Federal prosecutions multiplied, wiretaps expanded, grand juries worked overtime. Men who had spent decades operating in the shadows suddenly found themselves answering subpoenas instead of giving orders. Kennedy had declared war, and unlike previous administrations, he intended to finish it. The Mafia noticed. Jimmy Hoffa openly despised Robert Kennedy. Federal investigations and later testimony would reveal that Hoffa repeatedly discussed eliminating him, paying associates to monitor his movements and report on his daily routine. Kennedy's security by modern standards was astonishingly light. He often traveled in open convertibles, greeted crowds at arm's length, and moved through American cities with relatively little visible protection. Motorcades were rarely searched the way they would be after Dallas. Vehicles were not routinely swept for explosives. To many watching from the outside, the Kennedy brothers carried themselves with an air of complete invincibility, as though no one would dare strike at the heart of the American government. Yet behind closed doors, intelligence reports painted a far darker picture. Had Robert Kennedy devoted more attention to the intelligence flowing across J. Edgar Hoover's desk, he would have seen repeated reports describing organized crime figures, discussing violence against political leaders. Informants connected conversations to men such as Angelo Bruno, Russell Bufalino, Santo Trafficante Jr., Carlos Marcello, Johnny Roselli, and others, whose names surfaced repeatedly during federal investigations. Some threats appeared vague, others were disturbingly specific. At first, many underworld figures struggled to understand why the federal government had suddenly turned against them with such intensity. Some believed Hoover himself was orchestrating events, using whatever knowledge he possessed about the Kennedy family's political connections to maintain his own position. There were even threats directed toward Hoover, but as information filtered back through figures such as liquor magnate Louis Rosenstiel and other well-connected intermediaries, another conclusion began to emerge. This campaign was not Hoover's. Hoover himself had often been criticized for doing too little against organized crime during the 1950s. By 1958, according to numerous accounts, he was already compromised politically and institutionally. The driving force behind the offensive was Robert Kennedy. The focus shifted. If Hoover was not the architect, then Robert Kennedy was. Threats against both Robert and President John F. Kennedy became increasingly common. Informants later claimed that conversations ranged from general discussions of assassination to identifying locations where an attack might succeed. Dallas appeared more than once in intelligence reporting and later testimony, not because of a single organization, but because it represented the convergence of multiple hostile interests. Organized crime maintained significant influence there. So did violent segregationists enraged by the administration's civil rights policies. Anti-Kennedy extremists viewed the president as dangerously soft on communism in some areas, while others condemned him for confronting Castro too aggressively. Dallas also sat within a region deeply connected to anti-Castro Cuban exile networks, gun-running operations, military veterans and intelligence assets whose roots stretched back to the Office of Strategic Services during the Second World War. The political climate across much of the South had also turned poisonous. Kennedy's support for civil rights threatened long-established power structures. To segregationist politicians and their supporters, Washington had become the enemy. Hoover remained skeptical. He reportedly dismissed many of the threats, believing organized crime lacked the nerve to assassinate an American president. It was an assumption that history would brutally test. Robert Kennedy, meanwhile, was beginning to appreciate the size of the machine he was confronting. His investigations had exposed far more than traditional organized crime. He had learned about Operation Underworld, the wartime cooperation between U.S. naval intelligence and mafia figures. He had watched covert CIA operations expand throughout Latin America following Operation PB's success in Guatemala. He understood the strategic importance of the Caribbean, the Bahamas, and Cuba, where organized crime, intelligence operations, and anti-Castro activities increasingly overlapped. The massive heroin seizure of 1962 revealed international narcotics routes stretching from Europe into the United States. French Corsican networks, Sicilian intermediaries, American mafia families, and international traffickers appeared connected through increasingly sophisticated supply chains. The criminal world Robert Kennedy had declared war upon was no longer simply American. It had become global. Elsewhere, Cold War operations were reshaping Europe. Later investigations into Operation Gladio and related stay-behind networks would examine allegations that covert operations, political manipulation, and acts of terrorism were used in some countries to influence elections and contain communist influence. Whether every allegation proved accurate or not, Kennedy increasingly recognized that intelligence services possessed extraordinary power far beyond public scrutiny. America, he believed, was governed by institutions that operated both publicly and privately. Then came Joseph Valachi. When Valachi became the first major mafia insider to publicly describe La Cosa Nostra before Congress, Robert Kennedy gained an education unlike anything available in intelligence files alone. Valachi explained the significance of the Appalachian meeting. He described the commission, the hierarchy of organized crime, the relationships between families, and the growing importance of Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Pension Fund. He identified major figures including Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante Jr., Sam Giancana, and Johnny Roselli as influential members of a national criminal network that extended into gambling operations from Las Vegas to the Caribbean. The timing could hardly have been more dangerous. As the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war, the Kennedy administration simultaneously authorized covert operations against Fidel Castro. Some of those operations relied upon anti-Castro exiles and, at various stages, organized crime figures whom the CIA believed could assist in eliminating Castro. To many within organized crime, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Washington was using them abroad while prosecuting them relentlessly at home. Robert Kennedy underestimated how deeply rooted those criminal organizations truly were. Carlos Marcello's organization in Louisiana traced its origins to Italian criminal traditions that reached back into the 19th century. The Bufalino organization in Pennsylvania represented another old and disciplined network that had survived Prohibition, the Castellamarese War, and decades of federal pressure. These were not temporary gangs. They were institutions built across generations by men who had lived through political assassinations, revolutions, and organized violence long before the Kennedy family entered national politics. Then Dallas happened. When Robert Kennedy finally stood before his brother's coffin, witnesses recalled that he was overwhelmed with grief. He blamed himself for encouraging the relentless campaign against organized crime, wondering whether that war had contributed to the forces that now surrounded the assassination. Privately, he sought answers. CIA Director John McCone reportedly told him that the agency did not know who had killed the president. Yet Robert also learned that Lee Harvey Oswald had already appeared in numerous intelligence files. His trip to Mexico City, including visits to the Cuban and Soviet diplomatic compounds, had generated CIA reporting. Memoranda concerning Oswald passed through senior counterintelligence channels, including communications involving David Atlee Phillips and James Jesus Angleton. The existence of those files raised difficult questions that would persist for decades. Hoover faced his own reckoning. For years he had resisted acknowledging the national reach of organized crime. Now the President of the United States had been murdered, and the suspected assassin was a man whose background intersected with intelligence files, anti-Castro activism, and numerous unanswered questions. The one hope investigators still possessed was Lee Harvey Oswald himself. Then Jack Ruby stepped forward inside the Dallas police basement. One gunshot ended the only opportunity to question the accused assassin before a jury. With Oswald dead, the investigation entered an entirely different phase. In New Orleans, attention quickly shifted toward figures including David Ferry and Guy Bannister, as District Attorney Jim Garrison would later pursue his own controversial investigation. Robert Kennedy found himself in an impossible position. Before Dallas, he had helped oversee Special Group, Augmented, an interagency body established to coordinate covert Cuban operations and manage sensitive incidents involving Cuba. Castro had publicly warned that if American leaders continued attempting to assassinate him, they themselves could become targets. After his brother's death, Robert Kennedy faced the terrible irony that any investigation touching Cuba, covert operations or intelligence activities inevitably risked exposing operations his own administration had authorized. The man who had spent years trying to dismantle hidden networks now found himself trapped between seeking the truth and protecting some of the government's most closely guarded secrets. The war he had started had not ended in Dallas. It had only become far more complicated. When the Kennedys entered the White House, they did not begin the war against organized crime. They inherited it. Others had fought that battle long before Robert Kennedy arrived in Washington with subpoenas, Senate investigators, and federal prosecutors. Some had been beaten in the streets. Some had been threatened into silence. Some had been murdered. One man had sulfuric acid thrown into his face. His name was Victor Riesel. Riesel was a labor journalist who understood organized crime before much of official Washington was prepared to admit that a national mafia even existed. He wrote about corrupt unions, labor racketeers, political protection, and the alliance between gangsters and supposedly legitimate institutions. He named names when those names still carried the power to ruin careers, arrange beatings, and order killings. Luciano's people hated him. Genovese men hated him. The Gambino, Profaci, and Colombo factions had no use for him. Neither did the Chicago outfit, the Hoffa machine, or the labor racketeers who treated union treasuries as private banks. Riesel did not merely criticize the men who inherited those organizations. He attacked the men whose names had become the organizations. He wrote about them while they were still alive, still powerful, and still capable of reaching almost anyone. On April 5, 1956, after leaving a late-night radio broadcast in New York, Riesel was approached on the street. A man stepped close and threw sulfuric acid into his face. The attack blinded him permanently. The purpose was obvious. They wanted him frightened. They wanted him silent. They wanted every other journalist covering organized labor to understand what happened when a writer crossed the wrong people. Riesel returned to work. He could no longer see the men he was writing about, but he understood them better than most of the people who could. He had informants inside unions, police departments, federal agencies, and the underworld itself. Men called him because they trusted him. Others called because they were frightened. Some wanted revenge. Some simply wanted the truth placed somewhere beyond the reach of the men trying to bury it. By November 1963, Riesel had spent years studying the connections between organized crime, corrupt labor unions, and political power. Robert Kennedy had been fighting the mafia for a few years. Victor Riesel had been fighting it for most of his professional life. That difference mattered. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, Riesel began making calls. He spoke to sources he had cultivated over decades. He traced names, relationships, and old alliances. He followed the same routes he had followed through the labor rackets, the Teamsters, Chicago, and the National Syndicate. The information coming back to him pointed in one direction: the underworld. Riesel did not require Jack Ruby to be a made man or a major gangster. That was never the point. Ruby did not need to sit at a commission table. He only needed to belong to a network in which gangsters, union officials, gamblers, nightclub operators, fixers, and political intermediaries knew one another and exchanged favors. Ruby's history placed him inside that world. 2 days after Kennedy's murder, Ruby stepped from a crowd in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters and shot Lee Harvey Oswald in front of television cameras. The alleged assassin of the president was dead before he could stand trial. Almost immediately, Ruby was described as a distraught nightclub owner who had acted out of grief. His defenders insisted that his underworld connections were exaggerated. His brother Earl dismissed reports linking him to criminals. But the record emerging from Chicago told a more complicated story. Jack Ruby had been born Jacob Leon Rubenstein in Chicago in 1911. He grew up in the Maxwell Street district, a rough neighborhood where street hustlers, gamblers, political fixers and organized crime figures often occupied the same blocks. He acquired the nickname Sparky, reportedly because of his quick temper. Ruby liked sharp suits. He wore the kind of pearl grey fedora made fashionable by Al Capone, the brim broad and turned down in front. He acted tough, spoke loudly, and enjoyed being noticed. Those who knew him did not necessarily describe him as a hardened gangster. They described him as aggressive, nervous, ambitious, and desperate to belong. Police Captain Louis Caparelli, who had commanded the Maxwell district, remembered Ruby as a forceful salesman rather than a dangerous hoodlum. He wasn't a tough guy, as they say, Caparelli recalled, but he was a very aggressive salesman when he was selling something. Ruby liked being around policemen. He liked being around gamblers. He liked being around men with reputations. He behaved like a frustrated outsider, trying to convince everyone that he was already inside. That did not make him harmless. Ruby knew Paul Needle Nose Labriola, a Chicago hoodlum later murdered in 1954. He knew Paul Roland Jones, another Chicago figure, who would eventually land in federal prison on a narcotics conviction. He was also linked through business and social contacts to Nathan Gumbin, a wealthy Chicago businessman murdered gangland style in 1948. Ruby had lived briefly in San Francisco before the war, although police there found no evidence that he had been regarded as a known gangster. He appeared instead to exist along the outer edge of the underworld, close enough to recognize the important men, close enough to throw their names around, but never powerful enough to become one of them. Chicago remained the center of his world. In 1937, Ruby approached a lawyer named Leon Cook with a proposition. They would organize workers in the waste handling industry, an area where labor remained largely unorganized, and where control of workers could be turned into control of businesses. They secured a federal charter from the American Federation of Labor and created local 20,467 of the Waste Material Handlers Union. Ruby became secretary. He and Cook worked aggressively. They recruited workers and began building the local. The waste industry offered opportunities that gangsters understood immediately. A union controlling refuse collection, linen supply, restaurant labor, or industrial waste could pressure almost any business. A strike threat could close a restaurant, halt deliveries, or leave rubbish piling in the street. The union could become a weapon. On December 8, 1939, Leon Cook was shot to death. Riesel later described it in the language he used for men who understood what murder meant, but refused to decorate it. Someone had decided Cook was working too hard and eased his pain with some bullets. Ruby remained with the union briefly. Then the regional AFL office removed him. Into the organization came Paul Red Dorfman. Dorfman was a former boxer, a labor operator, and a close ally of Jimmy Hoffa. His arrival placed the Waste Material Handlers Union inside a far larger network, connecting Chicago organized crime, corrupt union officials, and the expanding Teamsters machine. Ruby was gone, but the organization he had helped create moved deeper into the world Robert Kennedy would later investigate. Dorfman remained influential for years. In 1957, the Waste Material Handlers Union was expelled from the AFL-CIO on corruption charges. Senate investigators later described its leadership as a bridge between Hoffa and the underworld. Its history became associated with graft, intimidation, beatings, and murder. Ruby's defenders argued that he had left long before the worst corruption emerged. Riesel saw continuity. Ruby had not wandered innocently into the waste handling business. He had helped build the structure. He had known Cook. He had remained close enough to men like Dorfman to understand what the union had become. When Dorfman was later asked about Ruby, he called him a real nice guy with liberal views. That description did not impress Victor Riesel. Riesel had followed Dorfman for years. During the McClellan Senate Rackets Committee investigation, Robert Kennedy had made Dorfman a major target. Kennedy assigned investigator James McShane, later Chief of the United States Marshals, to examine Dorfman's activities and his relationships with Hoffa and the Chicago underworld. On January 29, 1959, Kennedy questioned McShane before the committee. "Do you have some information?" Kennedy asked. "That would summarize your investigation, as well as the investigations that have been conducted by other government departments." McShane answered directly. "According to our investigation, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Paul Dorfman is a major figure in the Chicago underworld. He is an associate of most of the leading gangsters in the Chicago area. He is the contact man between dishonest union leaders and members of the Chicago underworld." McShane then listed the men surrounding Dorfman. Anthony Tony Accardo, described as the head of the Chicago mob following the Capone era. Abraham Teitelbaum, former attorney for the Capone organization. Abner Longy Zwillman, one of the most powerful racketeers in the country. John Diaguardi, known as Johnny Dio, the feared New York labor racketeer whose influence extended through the garment industry. These were not casual acquaintances. They represented a national system in which union officers, gangsters, lawyers, employers, and political intermediaries worked together. Dorfman served as a contact point between that system and Jimmy Hoffa. Jack Ruby had helped organize the union Dorfman later controlled. To Riesel, that connection could not be dismissed as ancient history. Ruby's Dallas nightclub added another layer. After leaving Chicago, Ruby moved to Dallas around 1947. He eventually operated clubs where policemen, gamblers, entertainers, and visiting underworld figures mixed freely. Ruby supplied officers with drinks, food, and access to dancers. He gave out passes. He cultivated relationships with law enforcement and behaved as though the police department was an extension of his social circle. His clubs were also visited by Chicago figures. Paul Jones and Paul Labriola traveled to Dallas in 1946 as part of a group examining the city's potential for organized rackets. According to accounts later gathered by investigators, the men spent time in Ruby's establishment while attempting to expand Chicago influence into Texas. They believed Dallas could produce at least $18 million a year through labor racketeering, gambling, and related operations. The plan did not end with Dallas. From Texas, they hoped to expand into Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. Their ambitions were enormous. One member of the group allegedly suggested that they proved their power by murdering 4 local gamblers, placing the bodies in a car and leaving it outside police headquarters. Paul Jones spoke in even broader terms. A Dallas police lieutenant later told the McClellan Committee that Jones had described a plan to organize every truck driver in the United States. "When we do that," Jones reportedly said, "we can bring industry to its knees, and even the government if we have to." The objective was not simply to collect union dues, it was to control transportation. A union that controlled the movement of goods could control factories, restaurants, construction projects, and entire cities. Trucks carried food, fuel, clothing, industrial equipment, and weapons. Stop the trucks, and the country stopped with them. Jones and his associates began pressuring Dallas businesses. Restaurant owners were forced to purchase meat from selected suppliers at inflated prices. Those who resisted could lose linen deliveries or find union workers suddenly unavailable. The method was simple. Control the workers, control the supply, control the business. But the Chicago men pushed too hard. Jones attempted to bribe a sheriff and was convicted. The expansion effort began to collapse. Chicago lost patience and recalled several of the men. Labriola eventually returned north. In 1954, he was found strangled in the back of a car, a wire tightened around his throat. Riesel wrote that the wire interfered with his breathing. And so went Needle Nose. The brutality was disguised by humor, But the point was clear. The men surrounding Ruby did not simply disappear into respectable retirement. They were imprisoned, murdered, or pulled back into the Chicago organization. Ruby knew them. He gambled in small amounts on boxing and baseball. He scalped tickets at sporting events, an occupation that brought him into regular contact with bookmakers, gamblers, and what police called characters. He frequented gambling rooms and conducted business with men who later died violently. He also liked to suggest that his influence reached higher than it did. Attorney Louis Kuttner later recalled Ruby attempting to attach himself to a Senate crime investigation in 1949. According to Kuttner, Ruby wanted to act as an advisor and perhaps present himself to the syndicate as a pipeline into the committee. Kuttner believed Ruby was trying to impress the boys. He was a nervous, ambitious, frustrated guy who never made the big time, Kuttner said. That may have been the most accurate description ever given of Jack Ruby. He was not a boss. He was not a strategist. He was not a man permitted to make policy. He was a man who wanted the bosses to know he was useful. For Riesel, that distinction made Ruby more dangerous, not less. The underworld depended upon men outside the formal hierarchy: nightclub owners, union organizers, lawyers, bail bondsmen, bookmakers, and policemen. They were not inducted members, but they could carry messages, provide introductions, arrange meetings, and perform services. Ruby lived in that space. By the time he shot Oswald, the connections surrounding him formed a direct historical line. Ruby had helped organize the Waste Material Handlers Union with Leon Cook. Cook had been murdered. Paul Dorfman had taken control. Dorfman became a close Hoffer associate and was identified under oath as a major Chicago underworld figure. Dorfman's associates included Accardo, Teitelbaum, Svillman, and Johnny Dio. Robert Kennedy had personally questioned the investigator who exposed those connections. Then, 4 years later, Jack Ruby killed the man accused of murdering Robert Kennedy's brother. Victor Riesel saw the shape of it immediately. On November 30th, 1963, only 8 days after the assassination, he published his findings. The column was later carried in newspapers across the country under titles including Tracing the Life of Killer Jack Ruby, Jack Ruby's Story Leads to Underworld, and Underworld's Snake Pit. Riesel described his investigation as a journey through the life of Ruby, his friends, and the friends of those friends. He had wandered, he wrote, through a snake pit populated by Needle Nose, Labriola, Paul Jones, men tied to Joe Valachi's Cosa Nostra, and killers and conmen from the old Capone Combine. He traced Ruby's nightclub to the Chicago group that had once tried to take over Dallas. He traced Ruby's union history to Leon Cook's murder. He traced Cook's replacement to Paul Dorfman. He traced Dorfman to Jimmy Hoffa and the Chicago outfit. He did not claim Ruby had ever become a major gangster. He argued something more significant. Ruby had spent his life moving through the underworld's outer circles. He had known its people, worked inside one of its unions, entertained its men, and attached himself to its police contacts. He had lived for years among the exact combination of labor racketeers, gamblers, night spot operators, and Chicago intermediaries that Robert Kennedy had placed under federal investigation. Then he had walked into a police basement and silenced Lee Harvey Oswald. To Riesel, that was not grief. It was not patriotism. It was not the spontaneous act of a broken-hearted nightclub owner. It was the act of a man whose entire life had prepared him to recognize when the underworld might need a favor. Whether Ruby had received an order, misunderstood an instruction, or acted in the hope of finally proving himself useful remained unanswered. But Riesel understood the machinery surrounding him. He had spent his career exposing it. He had lost his eyesight because of it. And when the rest of America looked at Jack Ruby and saw a volatile nightclub owner, Victor Riesel saw the snake pit behind him. At the heart of every successful criminal empire was the fix. It was the arrangement that gave a gangster room to breathe. The police officer who warned him before a raid, the judge who reduced a charge, the politician who buried an investigation, the union official who delivered labor peace, the businessman who opened a legitimate door, and the journalist who knew when not to print what he had heard. Violence could take territory. The fix allowed a man to keep it. It gave racketeers more than protection. It granted them a degree of acceptance inside respectable society. A gangster who had the right relationships no longer appeared to be standing outside government and business. He was already inside them. Few arrangements demonstrated the reach of the fix more clearly than the attempt to free Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa had been convicted in 1964 of attempting to corrupt the jury in his federal trial in Chattanooga. The government's most important witness had been Edward Grady Partin, the powerful leader of a Teamsters local in Baton Rouge. To free Hoffa, Partin's testimony had to be destroyed. According to Life, Hoffa's allies inside organized labor, and the underworld pooled $2 million into what became known as the Spring Hoffa Fund. In today's money, that represented roughly $19 million placed at the disposal of men prepared to sabotage the government's case. The money was ultimately entrusted to Carlos Marcello. That decision said everything about his standing. The New York families had their own political relationships. Chicago possessed one of the most effective machines in the country. Detroit had the unions. Las Vegas had the casinos. But when the national syndicate needed a federal witness neutralized in Louisiana, it turned to the little man. Marcello did not need to travel north and plead his case before the commission. He did not need to send an army into Baton Rouge. His strength came from the structure already surrounding Partin. Politicians, union officials, public relations operators, state employees, police officers, businessmen. Men who moved between legitimate government and the underworld so often that the boundary had almost disappeared. Partin had already received the first message. A series of dynamite explosions struck construction sites, trucks and oil drilling equipment belonging to companies whose workers were represented by his union. The damage was not random. It was a warning delivered through steel, fire, and broken machinery. Partin understood. He refused to move. The operation then shifted from intimidation to negotiation. Aubrey Young, a 45-year-old aide and confidant of Louisiana Governor John McKeithen, arranged a meeting with Partin. The governor was apparently unaware of what was taking place, but Young moved through a political world that overlapped with Marcello's organization. Behind the approach stood D'Alton Smith, a Louisiana public relations operator whose family occupied useful positions throughout the state. His brother served on the State Board of Education. His sister worked for the State Insurance Commission. Her husband, Nofio Pecora, had previously operated Marcello's Town and Country Motel, the headquarters from which the little man conducted much of his business. The meeting took place inside Young's Baton Rouge home. Smith was already waiting when Partin arrived. Young later claimed that he withdrew when he realized what was being discussed. Dalton told me he wanted to see if he could straighten out Partin's testimony to help Hoffa, Young told Life. When I saw what they were talking about in the parlor, I took a walk because I didn't want any part of it. Smith offered Partin $25,000 a year for 10 years. In modern purchasing power, the proposal amounted to approximately $240,000 annually, or around $2.4 million over the full decade. Partin refused. The offer rose. Eventually, according to Partin, the proposed payment reached $1 million, roughly $9.5 million today. All he had to do was recant, compromise his original testimony, or claim that illegal government surveillance had contaminated Hoffa's prosecution. He still refused. The approach failed, and Partin contacted the Justice Department. Soon afterwards, Aubrey Young disappeared into Marcello's Town and Country Motel for 3 days. When questions were raised, Young said he went there because politicians were always around. It was meant as a denial. It revealed the entire system. A governor's aide could seek refuge inside a motel identified as the headquarters of Louisiana's most powerful racketeer, and explain his presence by saying that it was where the politicians gathered. That was the fix. It did not require every public official to take an envelope directly from Carlos Marcello. Some men acted out of friendship. Others wanted campaign money. Some feared exposure. Some expected future business. Others convinced themselves that Marcello was simply another influential citizen whose cooperation helped keep Louisiana stable. The fix operated through rationalization as much as corruption. A mayor might privately despise organized crime, but suppress an investigation because exposing it would damage his party. A prosecutor might socialize with racketeers while insisting that personal relationships did not affect official decisions. A judge might attend barbecues at a mob boss's estate and explain that no cases were ever discussed. A journalist might soften an article after receiving a loan, a favor, or access to glamorous celebrities. A businessman might borrow money from a gangster and repay it by installing his jukeboxes, cigarette machines, or vending equipment. A sheriff might accept hospitality and later decide that a gambling operation was not quite notorious enough to close. The fix could be purchased. It could also be cultivated. Public relations advisors emphasized donations to hospitals, disaster victims, and children's organizations. Friendly reporters described mobsters as colorful personalities rather than predators. Celebrities photographed beside gangsters gave them the appearance of social legitimacy. The public participated without realizing it. The gangsters became entertainment. They were treated as dangerous but fascinating creatures, men to be watched, discussed, and sometimes admired, provided their violence remained hidden from respectable neighborhoods. No one demonstrated that contradiction more clearly than Sam Giancana. Giancana ruled the Chicago outfit, an organization of roughly 300 made members supported by thousands of associates, political workers, bookmakers, union officials, and corrupt policemen. He cultivated entertainers, businessmen, and politicians. His public association with singer Phyllis McGuire made him appear glamorous. His connections to Frank Sinatra made him appear close to national power. Newspapers covered his romances and golf games, while the machinery beneath him continued collecting gambling proceeds, bribing officials, and ordering murders. Giancana understood that celebrity could soften criminality. He also understood political organization. Chicago had refined the fix into a permanent institution. From offices across the street from City Hall, outfit representatives exercised influence through the First Ward political organization. The ward included the Loop, City Hall, the Cook County Courthouse, police headquarters, federal offices, hotels, railway terminals, the Chicago Stock Exchange, and the Board of Trade. It was the city's governmental and commercial center. The outfit stood directly inside it. The Democratic organization dominated the First Ward, but the Republicans remained useful. Outfit operatives could release enough Republican votes to preserve the appearance of a competitive election while ensuring that the preferred Democratic candidates remained safely in office. The purpose was not ideology. It was access. Giancana's rule followed the old instruction. Support both sides so that whoever wins already owes you something. Politicians, policemen, journalists, and business figures passed through First Ward headquarters to exchange favors. Stories could be softened or killed. Police investigations could be redirected. Candidates could be promoted, removed, or replaced. Pat Marcy, a former robber who became secretary of the First Ward Democratic Organization, served as one of the principal links between the outfit and Chicago politics. Murray Humphreys carried messages and packages to political allies. Gus Alex managed political and gambling interests. Sidney Korshak operated through a different world entirely, moving among lawyers, businessmen, film studios, labor leaders, and hotel executives. His influence was summarized in a sentence understood throughout Chicago. A message from Sidney is a message from us. Giancana could remove elected officials almost as easily as he removed members of his own organization. In 1962, First Ward Alderman John Darko committed what Giancana regarded as a humiliating mistake. While dining with the boss, Darko stood and shook hands with an FBI agent known to both men. To an ordinary politician, it was a gesture of courtesy. To Giancana, it was disloyalty. Darko was removed. Giancana selected State Senator Anthony de Tolve as a replacement, then changed his mind shortly before the election. The first ward remained without an alderman for a year. The machinery continued functioning without one. Congressman Roland Libonati also served the ward for years and occupied a seat on the powerful House Judiciary Committee. Giancana's son-in-law, Tony Tisci, worked on Libonati's congressional staff at an annual government salary of $11,829.84, equivalent to approximately $120,000 today. When Giancana decided Libonati had outlived his usefulness, the congressman withdrew from electoral politics. The official explanation involved his wife's health. The ward understood the real decision had been made elsewhere. This was the level of power Robert Kennedy confronted when he became Attorney General. Giancana believed elected officials throughout the country owed their positions to him and his allies. During intense FBI surveillance, he sent Charles English to deliver a message to the agents watching him. Giancana was willing to sit down with Robert Kennedy. The Attorney General could contact Frank Sinatra to arrange it. The proposal revealed Giancana's view of government. He did not see Kennedy as an untouchable representative of federal law. He saw him as another powerful man with whom terms could be negotiated. Kennedy rejected the approach. The FBI continued its pressure. Giancana was ultimately imprisoned for contempt after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury despite receiving immunity. Facing further legal pressure, he left the United States and directed parts of his organization from Mexico. But his absence did not destroy the Chicago fix. That was the point. A true criminal system did not depend on the boss being physically present. The ward organizations remained. The lawyers remained. The police contacts remained. The bookmakers continued taking bets. The union officials continued conducting business. The boss could leave. The machine stayed behind. Carlos Marcello possessed the same understanding, but his Louisiana system was different. Chicago had ward organizations and tightly constructed urban politics. Louisiana had no fence. Aaron Cohn, who arrived from Chicago in 1953 to lead the Metropolitan Crime Commission of New Orleans, quickly recognized the difference. In Chicago, he said, men generally stood on one side or the other. They were considered honest or crooked. In Louisiana, there was no clear dividing line. Marcello's power rested on that uncertainty. He did not have to own every politician. He only needed enough relationships spread across enough institutions to prevent government from acting as a single force against him. His organization operated through brothers, sons, trusted associates, and legitimate companies. Gambling interests were kept out of his name. Properties were held through corporations. Bookmaking, vending machines, bars, restaurants, motels, and transport businesses were divided among members of the family. From Jefferson Parish, Marcello directed a territory stretching from the Ozark foothills to the Mississippi Delta. His estimated personal wealth reached at least $40 million, equivalent to approximately $380 million to $400 million today. Even that figure may have understated his practical wealth, because much of his power came from untaxed cash, hidden interests, land, political influence, and monopolistic control rather than money sitting openly in a bank. He owned or controlled motels, vending operations, jukebox routes, a sightseeing company, and a 6,500-acre estate. The Town and Country Motel served as the organization's headquarters. The Jefferson Music Company extended loans to restaurant and tavern owners, who were then expected to install Marcello-controlled jukeboxes, cigarette machines, and pinball equipment. The Southern Sightseeing Tours Company dominated its sector in New Orleans. None of these businesses appeared especially threatening when viewed separately. Together, they created a network. Every machine placed in a bar generated cash. Every loan created an obligation. Every tavern owner became a source of information. Every driver heard conversations. Every motel room offered a meeting place. Every property created political leverage. Marcello's reach extended into Bossier City, Lafayette, Jennings, Morgan City, West Baton Rouge, and other open gambling territories. His organization maintained relationships with local law enforcement, racing officials, and sheriffs. In parts of Louisiana, reports even linked his vice operations to muscle supplied by Ku Klux Klan elements. He could finance legitimate public events. He could dine with members of the Racing Commission. He could offer the city hundreds of acres for a new domed stadium while anticipating a parking concession worth $1 million a year, nearly $10 million annually in current purchasing power. The proposal captured Marcello perfectly. It appeared generous. It was potentially enormously profitable. And it placed the government in the position of becoming commercially dependent upon a man it publicly denied was powerful. Even his immigration problems revealed his international reach. Marcello had been born in Tunisia to Italian parents, leaving American authorities struggling to find a country willing to accept him. According to contemporary reporting, he paid a senior Italian official $25,000 a year to ensure Italy continued refusing him, approximately $240,000 annually today. Most criminals bribed a policeman. Marcello was accused of bribing a nation. That was why the national mafia trusted him with Hoffa. Marcello controlled more than a criminal family. He controlled an environment. Santo Trafficante Jr. possessed a similar advantage in Florida. Tampa was not merely a southern city. Like New Orleans, it was a gateway. Cuba lay offshore. The Bahamas offered banking and casinos. Miami connected the American mainland to Latin America. Ships, aircraft, and migrant communities linked Florida to Havana, Santo Domingo, Panama, Costa Rica, Venezuela, and Colombia. The Trafficante family had developed within that world for decades. Santo Trafficante Sr. built gambling and bolita networks in Tampa and maintained relationships in Cuba. His son inherited those connections and expanded them into an international system involving casinos, bookmaking, narcotics, and covert operations. A major bookmaking organization connected to the Trafficante network reportedly handled more than $100,000 in wagers each week during the 1970s, the equivalent of approximately $600,000 to $700,000 a week today. At moments of peak activity, it accepted around $3,500 in bets during a single minute, approximately $20,000 to $25,000 in modern value. That could not be accomplished by a neighborhood bookmaker with a telephone and a notebook. It required a national network. Odds came from Las Vegas, Cleveland, or New York. Large bets were laid off with other organizations to balance risk. Money traveled through collectors, bookmakers, banks, and businesses. Police protection was necessary. Telephone systems were essential. A successful bookmaker was not freelancing. He was plugged into a criminal corporation. Trafficante's reach extended much further. He had lived in Cuba and maintained relationships inside the Havana casino world. He knew Batista's officials, casino operators, Cuban exiles, and intelligence intermediaries. After Castro took power, he became one of the organized crime figures approached in the CIA's plots to assassinate the Cuban leader. The government considered him dangerous enough to prosecute at home. It considered him useful enough to employ abroad. That contradiction gave the Southern Mafia unusual leverage. Marcello and Trafficante knew where government secrets were buried because parts of their organizations had participated in the operations. They knew the pilots. They knew the exiles. They knew the smugglers. They knew the casino operators, union officials, and intelligence intermediaries who moved between the legitimate and covert worlds. Their power could not be measured only in soldiers. The New York families were larger. Chicago had more made men. But Marcello and Trafficante possessed geography. Marcello controlled the gateway from the Mississippi Valley into the Gulf of Mexico. Trafficante controlled access through Florida into Cuba and the Caribbean. Between them lay ports, airports, fishing vessels, fruit companies, banks, casinos, and shipping routes capable of moving almost anything: money, weapons, narcotics, fugitives, intelligence, men marked for death. The Southern Mafia operated in regions where political institutions were often local, personal, and vulnerable. Sheriffs controlled individual parishes and counties. Prosecutors depended on local electorates. Judges socialized with businessmen whose companies relied on mob-controlled labor or financing. There was no single wall to penetrate. There were hundreds of doors. The fix opened them one at a time. By the early 1960s, Robert Kennedy faced more than Marcello Trafficante or Giancana as individuals. He faced the machinery surrounding them. A criminal boss could be indicted. A political environment could not. A gangster could be deported. His businesses, relatives, lawyers, and public officials remained. A bookmaker could be arrested. The national betting network replaced him. A casino could be closed. The money moved to another island. The Southern Mafia survived because they had learned every lesson offered by the 20th century. Prohibition taught it transportation. The Depression taught it cash management. The unions taught it institutional power. The Caribbean taught it international finance. The Second World War taught it the value of intelligence relationships. Cuba taught it covert warfare. The fix held everything together. That was the true power of Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. They did not merely control rackets, they controlled access to politicians, ports, unions, foreign governments, intelligence operatives, and criminal markets stretching across the southern United States and deep into the Caribbean. Their organizations were smaller than the great families of New York. Their world was larger. Money was only one part of the fix. Information was often more valuable. A corrupt police officer could warn a bookmaker that a raid was coming. A clerk inside a prosecutor's office could reveal which witnesses were cooperating. A politician could disclose the names of investigators assigned to a case. A friendly official could identify the telephone lines being monitored before the first wiretap was installed. The government believed it was hunting the mafia. The mafia was often reading the government's plans before the hunt began. In 1962, Attorney General Robert Kennedy circulated a confidential list identifying the gangsters his department intended to target. Within weeks, a copy of that list reportedly appeared inside a Michigan Avenue office used by Sam Giancana and Gus Alex. The document had traveled from the highest levels of the Justice Department into the hands of the very men it was meant to destroy. That was the real value of political corruption. A bribe could make one charge disappear. Intelligence allowed an entire organization to prepare. Telephones could be changed, books could be moved, witnesses could be approached, businesses could be transferred into other names. Men under surveillance could leave the country before agents reached their doors. Kennedy was not simply fighting criminals, he was fighting criminals who had sources inside the government. The public rarely saw that side of Sam Giancana. To outsiders, Giancana appeared surrounded by glamour. He was photographed with entertainers and pursued by reporters fascinated by his relationship with singer Phyllis McGuire. His connection to Frank Sinatra allowed him to move close to celebrities, businessmen, and political figures who would never have openly associated with an ordinary street criminal. The glamour concealed the machinery beneath him. Behind the nightclub tables and celebrity photographs stood men such as James Torello, Fiore Buccieri, and John Jackie Cerrone. These were not society gangsters. They were outfit soldiers who discussed torture and murder with the casual detachment of mechanics describing a difficult repair. One of their victims was William Jackson, a 350-pound outfit enforcer who had fallen under suspicion. According to an informant's account, Jackson was suspended from a meat hook and tortured over several days before he died. The men who later described the killing reportedly laughed about the weight of his body bending the hook and spoke enthusiastically about the use of an electric prod. Their amusement was more revealing than the violence itself. To them, Jackson's death was not an extraordinary act. It was office business. The conversation moved easily from Jackson to other methods of punishment. Victims had been chained to stretching devices, deprived of water, and subjected to prolonged torture. The men exchanged details as though discussing tools of the trade. That was the organization hidden behind Giancana's public image. The celebrity friendships did not civilize the outfit, they disguised it. Giancana did not necessarily carry out the violence himself, he did not have to. As boss, he approved contracts, assigned responsibility, and determined when a man had become a danger to the organization. Even from Mexico, his influence remained. The machinery he had built in Chicago continued operating through political ward organizations, labor contacts, bookmakers, lawyers, and men prepared to enforce his decisions. But Giancana understood that violence was never enough. A criminal empire needed political insurance. His guiding principle was simple: back the winner. Better still, back both sides. In 1961, while discussing hidden interests in the Stardust Hotel and Casino, Giancana reportedly explained the outfit's political strategy in a single sentence: "Do like we do in Chicago. Give to both parties." That was not generosity. It was risk management. The Mafia did not care whether a candidate called himself a Democrat or a Republican. It cared whether he answered the telephone after the election. A contribution to one party purchased influence. Contributions to both purchased protection from democracy itself. No one understood that system better than Meyer Lansky. Lansky could never become a formal member of Cosa Nostra because he was Jewish, but he had become indispensable to the men who ruled it. He understood banks, casinos, taxes, hidden ownership, international finance, and the movement of cash across borders. He also understood the skim. The skim was removed from a casino before it appeared on the official books. It was never declared as revenue, never reported to regulators, and never subjected to tax. Cash disappeared from the counting room and traveled to secret owners through couriers, numbered accounts, and offshore banks. Nevada was open territory. Chicago, Cleveland, Miami, and New York could all invest there, provided the families respected one another's interests. Representatives from across the country watched the casinos, protected the hidden ownership, and ensured that each organization received its share. That gave the Mafia an enormous interest in Nevada politics. In 1963, the Fremont Casino maintained a political contribution budget of $19,500, approximately $213,000 in 2026 purchasing power. Lansky's personal approval was required before the money could be distributed. The payments reached every level of government. A Nevada Supreme Court justice was allocated $5,000, equivalent to about $55,000 today. A justice of the peace received $200, or roughly $2,200 today. A county commissioner was assigned $300, approximately $3,300 today. A state assemblyman and a candidate for lieutenant governor were each allocated $500, the equivalent of about $5,500 apiece. At the national level, one political figure received $1,000, or roughly $11,000 today. His opponent received $12,000, approximately $131,000 in modern purchasing power. The imbalance suggested that the Mafia had a preference. The payments to both sides ensured that preference did not become a liability. The money purchased influence in Las Vegas, Carson City, and Washington. It protected Ed Levinson, the operator of the Fremont, but it also protected Lansky and the hidden interests behind the casino. Levinson's connections reached directly into national politics. He and Benjamin Siegelbaum, one of Lansky's trusted skim couriers, were involved with Bobby Baker in the Serve-You vending machine business. Baker was secretary to the Senate Democratic majority and a close associate of Lyndon Johnson. Once again, legitimate business, gambling money, and national politics met inside the same operation. Major Riddle, an operator at the Dunes, explained the economics of political influence without pretending it was anything else. When casino owners objected to a proposed $20,000 contribution to a senior figure in Governor Grant Sawyer's administration, Riddle defended the payment. The official did whatever they wanted. Any one of the favors he performed could be worth the entire amount. In current purchasing power, that $20,000 contribution would be worth approximately $218,000. Riddle considered it a bargain. He compared it with the $200,000 reportedly paid by interests associated with the Desert Inn to another influential politician, the equivalent of roughly $2.2 million today. Those were not campaign donations in any normal democratic sense. They were investments. A casino might pay hundreds of thousands in modern money to secure a license, block an investigation, influence a regulatory decision, or guarantee that hidden ownership remained hidden. Irving Devine, a Las Vegas racketeer seeking a gaming license, was prepared to contribute $50,000 to the governor's re-election campaign, approximately $545,000 today, in exchange for approval. The proposed transaction failed only after federal disclosures exposed Devine's links to the skimming organizations. The fix had limits. Publicity was one of them. A politician could accept money so long as the arrangement remained private. Once the connection became public, the same official who had been willing to help could suddenly discover principles. Nevada and Chicago were not exceptions. The system existed wherever organized crime became strong enough to negotiate with government. In New England, Raymond Patriarca ruled a disciplined organization of approximately 150 members spread across Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Maine. Patriarca was more than a racketeer. Within his territory, he acted like a private governor. Major crimes required his approval. Gangland disputes were brought before him. He authorized killings, arranged political payments, and decided which independent criminals would be permitted to operate. According to FBI recordings, Patriarca served as the final authority during a Boston gang war that claimed more than 40 lives. At least a dozen murders were attributed by investigators to orders originating with him. When rival factions ignored an armistice he had declared, Patriarca threatened to impose what he called martial law. The language revealed how he viewed his position. He did not consider himself merely the head of a criminal family. He believed he governed a territory. Bank robberies, hijackings, arson, jewel thefts, and kidnappings were all matters that could reach his office. Criminals who operated without permission risked punishment from the organization as well as prosecution by the state. For more than 3 years, however, the FBI had a microphone hidden inside Patriarca's Providence headquarters. The recordings were a catastrophe. They captured discussions of murders, political influence, and underworld disputes. They identified killers and exposed the authority with which Patriarca ruled New England. The microphone also saved lives. The FBI heard repeated plans to murder William Maffeo and John Beale. Agents warned the intended victims and alerted local authorities each time an attempt was discussed. Then in 1965, legal restrictions forced the FBI to disconnect the device. Within a year, Maffeo was murdered in Providence. Beale was later killed in Miami. The microphone had not changed Patriarca's intentions. It had only delayed their execution. Patriarca also sat in judgment over politicians. In 1963, a defeated Rhode Island official became involved in a dispute with one of his financial backers. The businessman claimed that $17,000 given to the campaign had been a loan and demanded its return. The politician insisted it had been a contribution. Patriarca heard the case behind the vending machines in his Coin-O-Matic office. He ruled for the politician. The $17,000, approximately $185,000 today, was declared a gift. The businessman was told to forget about it. He did. Patriarca handled his own political money more carefully. His organization maintained what became known as Raymond's Escrow Fund. Politicians were not paid merely for making promises. Money was released after they delivered. It was payment by results. In 1963, Patriarca and Thomas Lucchese reportedly held hidden interests in the Berkshire Downs racetrack in Massachusetts. The track needed the state legislature to extend its racing season to remain profitable. Patriarca let it be known that $25,000 would be available for political distribution if the measure passed, approximately $273,000 today. The legislature rejected the proposal. The money remained in escrow. No result, no payment. In everyday matters, the New England fix worked with greater efficiency. On July 27, 1962, a senior state police officer warned Jerry Angulo, Patriarca's Boston underboss, that gambling establishments at Revere Beach would be raided the following day. When police arrived, the 5 establishments connected to Patriarca were closed. Only the independent bookmakers were caught. The following Tuesday, the protected operations reopened at different addresses and absorbed the customers of the men who had been arrested. The government raid had not damaged the mafia. It had eliminated the mafia's competition. 3 years later, almost the same sequence occurred again. Advance warning, temporary closure, raids against independents, mob-controlled businesses reopening after the danger passed. The police were not merely failing to stop organized crime, their enforcement operations were helping it consolidate the market. That was the highest form of the fix. The state itself became an instrument of criminal monopoly. Patriarca's own greed eventually created enemies inside his organization. Joseph Barboza, a feared New England gunman, was imprisoned on an unrelated charge. His associates began collecting money to finance an appeal. Patriarca's men reportedly ambushed 2 of those associates, killed them, and took the $80,000 they had raised, worth approximately $830,000 today. Barboza was left in prison without his money and without the loyalty he believed his service had earned. He turned government witness. The decision illustrated one of organized crime's permanent weaknesses. The fix could corrupt police officers, judges, and politicians. It could not always protect a boss from his own greed. In New Jersey, the cost of political protection had become so high that gangsters complained about inflation among corrupt officials. In February 1963, Genovese figures Angelo DiCarlo and Tony Russo met inside a rundown club known as the Barn on Route 22. A law enforcement informant sat with them while they discussed the demands of a senior New Jersey state police officer. The official reportedly collected $250 a month for ignoring bookmakers near Monmouth Park, about $2,700 per month today. He received another $1,000 a month from gambling interests in Long Branch and $1,000 from Asbury Park, each payment worth approximately $10,900 per month today. Joe Ziccarelli's Hudson County operation reportedly contributed another $5,000 every month, the modern equivalent of nearly $55,000 monthly. During the profitable summer season, the officer demanded that the payments be doubled. The gangsters were furious, not because he was corrupt, because he was becoming too expensive. The irony was that DiCarlo, Russo, and Ziccarelli had helped create him. They had selected the policeman and used a well-connected political figure to secure his promotion into a position where he could protect their operations. They had built their own problem. The officer continued collecting until his retirement. He cost them heavily, but he remained too valuable to remove. In Cosa Nostra language, he represented a solid setup, direct relationship with a senior law enforcement official who could influence policy, personnel, and investigations. A patrolman could ignore a gambling room. A policymaker could protect the entire network. In Long Branch, Russo claimed that the mob possessed everything that mattered: the police, the councilmen, the elections, the city administration. "What we got in Long Branch is everything," he boasted. "Police we got, councilmen we got too. We're going to make millions." The ambition had already moved beyond gambling. Road construction, electrical contracts, public works, municipal appointments. Once a criminal organization controlled the officials awarding contracts and enforcing regulations, Legitimate industry became another racket. Investigators later concluded that De Carlo, Ziccarelli, and Ruggiero Boiardo had helped place a mob associate into the position of police superintendent in a major New Jersey city. Before entering law enforcement, the man had reportedly worked as a doorman at illegal dice games. The transformation was almost perfect. The gangster's employee had not bribed the police chief. He had become the police chief. Joseph Bayon Joe Ziccarelli carried the system even further. Publicly, he appeared to be a Hudson County bookmaker and lottery operator with an expensive obsession for political contacts. In reality, his reach crossed national borders. Ziccarelli held interests in Venezuela and the Dominican Republic. He developed a reputation as a broker capable of securing arms and ammunition for foreign clients. His services could be used by governments suppressing rebellions or by rebels attempting to overthrow governments. He reportedly conducted business with the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo. He also dealt with men who opposed and eventually succeeded him. Loyalty followed payment. The principle was the same one Giancana applied to American elections. Give to both parties, sell to both armies, remain useful to whoever wins. By then, organized crime no longer resembled the neighborhood organizations that had emerged from immigrant districts at the beginning of the century. Its men influenced elections, installed police chiefs, financed politicians, controlled racetracks, moved money through casinos, and supplied arms to foreign regimes. The bosses had become private ministers. The lawyers became their diplomats. The bookmakers became their bankers. The political fixers became their intelligence service. And the police officers they purchased became their early warning system. Robert Kennedy could circulate a confidential list. Giancana would soon possess a copy. Authorities could plan a raid. Patriarcha's bookmakers would close the night before. A legislature could debate a racing bill. Money would already be waiting in escrow. A foreign government could require weapons. Ziccarelli knew where to obtain them. This was not corruption at the edges of American society. It was a shadow administration operating within it. The fix did not merely protect organized crime from government. In some places, it allowed organized crime to borrow the powers of government for itself. By the late 1960s, the American Mafia had evolved into something far removed from the neighborhood gangs that had emerged from Little Italy decades earlier. Every stage of its history had forced it to learn. Prohibition had taught it logistics. The Depression had taught it politics. The Second World War had taught it intelligence. The Cold War taught it how to think internationally. Every crisis made it richer, smarter, and more dangerous. The public still imagined gangsters as men collecting protection money from corner shops. Robert Kennedy knew they had become something else entirely. The old rackets had become multinational enterprises. A gambling boss was no longer simply a bookmaker. He might also own trucking companies, vending machine routes, hotels, restaurants, bus lines, real estate developments, banks and shipping interests spread across several countries. The organization had become an economic system. Nothing demonstrated that transformation better than the Southern Mafia. To many Americans, New York remained the center of organized crime. The real expansion, however, was taking place hundreds of miles further south. Carlos Marcello ruled Louisiana. Santo Trafficante Jr. ruled Florida. Together, they controlled America's gateway into the Caribbean and Latin America. They did not simply dominate cities, they dominated geography. Federal investigators estimated Carlos Marcello's fortune at more than $40 million by the mid-1960s, roughly $400 million in today's purchasing power. He owned motels, a sightseeing bus company, a jukebox and vending machine empire, thousands of acres of land, restaurants, and extensive real estate holdings, while investigators believed many additional businesses were hidden behind relatives and associates. His 6,500-acre Churchill Farms estate became both a symbol of his wealth and a meeting place where politicians, businessmen, judges, and law enforcement officials crossed paths with remarkable ease. Marcello rarely needed to advertise his influence. People simply came to him. Aaron Cohn, the longtime head of New Orleans Metropolitan Crime Commission, eventually realized Louisiana operated by different rules. Chicago had honest men and crooked men. Louisiana often had both inside the same room. As Cohn later reflected, there simply wasn't a fence separating the two. That absence of a dividing line became Marcello's greatest strength. He did not conquer Louisiana through violence alone. He built relationships, district attorneys, judges, sheriffs, businessmen, union officials, political advisors, casino operators, restaurant owners, bankers. Every successful criminal empire required a fix. Marcello built one that stretched across an entire state. His town and country motel functioned as an unofficial headquarters. His Jefferson Music Company dominated jukeboxes and vending machines throughout Jefferson Parish. Restaurant owners accepted loans, only to discover they were expected to install Marcello's machines. Every cigarette machine, every jukebox, every pinball machine generated cash. Cash generated skim. Skim generated political influence. Political influence generated protection. Protection produced more cash. The cycle became self-reinforcing. His gambling interests reached Jennings, Lafayette, Morgan City, West Baton Rouge, Bossier City, Highway 190. Even his proposed donation of land for New Orleans' future domed stadium promised enormous commercial rewards through parking concessions that investigators estimated could produce around $1 million annually, the equivalent of roughly $10 million a year today. Marcello understood something many businessmen eventually learned. The land surrounding a project could become more valuable than the project itself. Florida presented an equally valuable opportunity. While Marcello controlled the Mississippi River and Louisiana's ports, Santo Trafficante controlled America's southern doorway. For decades, Tampa had prospered from gambling. By the mid-1970s, investigators believed gambling had been overtaken by something even more profitable: narcotics. According to investigators interviewed during a lengthy investigation by the Tampa Times, organized crime in Tampa had expanded into bookmaking, pornography, and international drug trafficking, while maintaining direct links to mafia organizations across the United States. Some local officials insisted organized crime barely existed. A statewide grand jury reached precisely the opposite conclusion. Its members concluded that gambling, narcotics, and prostitution could not flourish at such levels without official corruption. Investigators described Tampa as one of the principal bookmaking centers on Florida's Gulf Coast. The money involved was staggering. Investigators estimated that bookmakers in one South Florida county alone generated around $1.5 billion annually. Adjusted for today, that represents almost $9 billion every year. A single Trafficante-connected betting operation reportedly handled over $100,000 every week, equivalent to roughly $580,000 weekly today, while prosecutors told jurors it could process nearly $3,500 worth of wagers in a single minute, more than $20,000 per minute in modern purchasing power. Bookmaking was no longer an after-hours gambling racket. It had become industrialized. The profits financed expansion into even larger markets. Federal testimony later alleged that Santo Trafficante traveled through Bangkok and South Vietnam during the late 1960s, while investigators linked his organization to international narcotics routes extending through Southeast Asia, Costa Rica, and Florida. Other associates were later prosecuted on major cocaine and marijuana trafficking charges connected to the wider Trafficante organization. These allegations came from Senate testimony and law enforcement investigations rather than criminal convictions against Trafficante himself. The route itself mattered more than any individual shipment. Costa Rica, Panama, Guatemala, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, the Bahamas, the Caribbean. Every one of those locations appeared repeatedly throughout federal investigations involving Marcello, Trafficante, Lansky, and their associates. Bananas, sugar, coffee, shipping, tourism, casinos, real estate, banking. Each industry provided legitimate commerce. Each could also conceal illicit commerce. Containers that carried fruit one week could carry something else the next. Money earned from casinos could disappear through offshore banks. Tourist hotels could become meeting places for businessmen, intelligence officers, politicians, and organized crime figures. The Southern bosses occupied the crossroads of all of it. Contemporary reporting described Carlos Marcello and Raymond Patriarca as more powerful than several members who formerly sat on the Mafia Commission, despite generally following its directives. Their authority rested less on titles than on territory, wealth, and political influence. That distinction mattered. Power did not necessarily flow from New York. It increasingly flowed through the Gulf Coast. Control New Orleans, you influenced the Mississippi. Control Tampa, you influenced the Caribbean. Together they formed the southern hinge of organized crime's international expansion. By now, Robert Kennedy understood he was no longer confronting isolated criminal families. He was confronting parallel institutions. They owned transportation. They financed construction. They influenced labor. They invested in banks. They operated internationally. They cultivated politicians. They penetrated law enforcement. They developed intelligence networks that often warned them before federal agents even arrived. The old mafia had been territorial. The new mafia was global. Its executives rarely carried guns. They carried briefcases. Its battles were increasingly fought in boardrooms, banks, casinos, and government offices rather than dark alleyways. By the end of the 1960s, Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante were no longer simply Southern crime bosses. They had become international businessmen operating inside a criminal multinational. And that was the lesson Robert Kennedy had slowly uncovered. The Mafia had not merely survived America's attempts to destroy it. It had adapted faster than the government trying to stop it. It learned every lesson, then built an empire from them.